everybody. My name is Duncan Wood. It's a great pleasure, an honor to be with you here tonight on the campus of the University of California in Los Angeles. I want to take a moment to begin with by thanking our partners, the Asociación de Empresarios Mexicanos, the AEM, who are a wonderful group of people who are pushing very, very hard right now for continued positive relations between Mexico, the United States, and of course North America in general. I've worked with the AEM for many years from Washington and in Texas, and it's been a great pleasure to be able to collaborate with you all again. And my good friend Fernando will be saying a few words in a little while. Also, of course, want to thank not just UCLA, but the ASUCLA for hosting us here in this terrific space. It's an intimate space, but it's got plenty of room for us. The lighting is incredible. I don't know how I look. Maybe the lighting's terrible. Maybe I look like I'm death warmed up. I don't know. But it feels very bright, at least. And Puria, you promised when I first arrived in LA that you would help us out, and you have been true to your word. Thank you so much, my friend. A round of applause. Thank you so much. I also want to say a quick word, which is a tradition here at the University of California in Los Angeles, that the university acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, who were the original inhabitants of this part of California. And I know that to our Canadian friends, that's something that means a great deal. It's an invocation which is used on a regular basis across the country in Canada. And that brings me to thanking our partners from the Consulates General of Mexico and Canada. Delighted to have both Consuls General here today at a time when we need unity more than ever. It's a great delight to be able to hear both of your thoughts on the current moment in North America. We titled this event Trump 2.0 and the North American Opportunity because we wanted to put a positive spin on things as much as is possible. We wanted to think about all the reasons why North America matters. An integrated manufacturing production platform, cross-border investment, the flows of people, of goods, of course, and the fact that over the past 40 years, North America has become one of the most competitive, if not the most competitive regions in the world. That has been built on the back of trade agreements such as the NAFTA and now the USMCA, or the CUSMA as they call it in Canada, or the TMEC as they call it in Mexico. Those agreements, which are trading agreements, are also vitally important for sustaining cross-border investment, competitiveness, and of course, high levels of employment. At the Pacific Council, we believe that issue of maintaining North American competitiveness is one of the most important issues facing the United States today. And of course, it's under examination in Washington. We know all about the tariffs that have been put on hold for the time being, and those that haven't been put on hold for the time being on steel and aluminum. And we'll be entering into an in-depth conversation about those issues tonight. On a personal note, I was born in the UK, but I was educated in Canada, lived in Mexico for 17 years. 2 of my kids were born in Mexico. They're little Canadian, British, Mexican, first of all, because that's where they were born, at the Hospital Ingles in Mexico City. They are these little hybrids who continue to run around North America. I then moved to Washington, and I now have a 4-year-old little gringa, a little American, who is the love of my life. And so I like to always say at these events that I feel that I am the father of North America, or at least of some North Americans. And what I've seen over the past 30 years of my life by living in North America is that this is an extraordinarily dynamic region. It's one in which we see the economic integration, of course, but we're also seeing increasingly high levels of social integration. On the political front, we're living through a stressful time. There's no point in covering it up. But I do believe, and I hope this comes out in our conversation later on, I do believe that the future for North America is extremely bright. And the reason why I believe that is because of all the people that I see on a daily basis working very, very hard, not just to protect what has been achieved already, but to move forward onto the next thing. And we saw this during the first Trump administration. When the North American Free Trade Agreement was under threat, people rallied. And what did we get? We got a 21st century free trade agreement, the USMCA. Not a perfect agreement by any stretch of the imagination, but a very, very good agreement, and perhaps the last free trade agreement that the United States will sign for a very long time. That didn't just preserve North American competitiveness, but it advanced it at a time when the United States was entering into a geopolitical and geoeconomic struggle with China on a global scale. As I always say, the only reason why North American, and in particular American firms are competitive is because they fit into the integrated supply chains of North America involving Canadian and Mexican firms. That's enough from me for now. I've set the scene, but I want to give an introduction to our honored host here, UCLA President Julio Frenk. I've known Julio for a while, but I've known of him for much longer. When I lived and worked in Mexico, I was a professor at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, the ITAM, and Julio Frenk was one of the leading lights in politics at the time, and in particular in the field of health. A distinguished figure in global health and higher education, Dr. Frenk brings a wealth of experience from his previous leadership positions to UCLA. Prior to this, he served as the president of the University of Miami from 2015 to 2024, where he led the university through the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, orchestrated a remarkable turnaround of his academic health system, and launched a highly successful fundraising campaign in advance of the university's centennial. His career is marked, though, by his significant contributions to public health in Mexico, where I first learned of him. As the nation's Secretary of Health from 2000 to 2006, he implemented the Seguro Popular, a comprehensive national health insurance program that expanded healthcare access to over 55 million previously uninsured individuals. That was a paradigm-shifting event in Mexico, I remember, at the time. It was highly transformative, and it significantly reduced the proportion of uninsured citizens in Mexico. In addition to that, his scholarly work has been widely recognized with numerous publications and citations in the fields of health systems and policy. And as he embarks on his tenure here at UCLA, he's committed to fostering a culture of inclusivity and advancing the university's mission of public service and academic excellence. His multifaceted experience positions him uniquely to lead UCLA into a new era of innovation and societal impact. And for that reason, and for many others, we're delighted that you're here with us today. Welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Duncan. You're very kind. We have interacted many times, and Duncan is a very, very highly regarded analyst, policy analyst, a person who informs a lot of the conversation in Mexico about some of the topics we're going to discuss today. But let me start just by then, having heard you, offer my own North American credentials. My dear wife, Dr. Felicia No, who's herself a very distinguished scholar and economist of the social sectors, is Canadian. I, of course, was born in Mexico and spent most of my life in Mexico, and we now live in the United States. We have two daughters who have Mexican and Canadian and American passports. So we truly are a NAFTA, or whatever it is called now, family. So I have those elements that we share, Duncan. Welcome to UCLA, and let me also echo my thanks to UCLA, which is a fantastic organization for offering this great space. We are delighted that we can be a partner of this important discussion, and we're really very honored to have with us Ambassador Carlos González Gutiérrez, who's the Consul General of Mexico in Los Angeles, and Zaib, Shaikh, who is the Consul General of Canada in Los Angeles. Welcome. I'm hoping soon to try to invite the Consular Corps to UCLA, because I believe that's a very important part of our relationship to the community. And of course, welcome to all our panelists, whom Duncan will introduce in a moment. I'll be very brief because I think we all want to get into the panel. I started my tenure here on January 1st, so I am really a new chancellor, and it's been quite a month with the wildfires starting on my second day of my first full week. The second day of that I was in my office, the wildfires started. But anyway, fortunately, I have had a lot of experience, or unfortunately, but whatever the case may be, I have had a lot of experience with emergencies, and that was a terrible, terrible tragedy for this city, the worst disaster probably in the history of LA. In addition to taking care of our own people, about 2,000 of our employees or students were directly affected. Over 200 lost their homes, were burned to the ground, many were evacuated. We decided that that was an opportunity to connect even more to our community here in Los Angeles. So we've been very active both in the recovery phase, initial recovery phase, and also now as we partner with the authorities in mobilizing our expertise as we think of how those LA rebuilds into a more resilient and better set of urban infrastructure to withstand some of these consequences of climate change. So, and we've labeled all of those activities as UCLA Connects, because I do think that one of the functions of universities is to be connective, is to actually engender connections among people. And that's why I think that one of the great functions of any university, but particularly this one, is to serve as a convener, take advantage of partnerships with many to bring people together to discuss some of the most important topics of our times. We try in that idea of connect scholars and researchers with policymakers and practitioners. That's a big part of what we do. It is not an ivory tower. It is actually a connective tissue of a community if we do our job well. And we also connect geographies. We, of course, connect generations. That's what we do in education. And we connect disciplines when we try to tackle big problems in an interdisciplinary way. But we connect geographies. And that's why, while we are deeply connected to our local community in Los Angeles, I like to say we are not a university in Los Angeles, but a university of Los Angeles, we also are deeply connected to the global community, because everything today is local, is simultaneously global and local. These are not alternative realities, they are actually deeply connected. So clearly the times are ripe for this kind of discussion, analyzing what opportunities lie ahead, along with the threats, but the threats are better known and better covered in the day-to-day media. I think a larger perspective is something that is very much needed. So I, as a global institution, simultaneously global and local, I am delighted that we have the opportunity to host you all for this conversation. You'll be hearing from our great panelists, Fernando Sepúlveda, who's a friend from many, many years. They will be illuminating us under the leadership of Duncan. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for choosing UCLA as the venue for your conversation. And I look forward to a great conversation tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you, Julio. One of the most important words of thank you that I have to give is, of course, to the man who's going to make the cocktail hour possible afterwards, Dr. Javier Martinez. I want to say thank you because it's a vital part of our Pacific Council gatherings generally, and particularly this wouldn't be a North American event if we didn't have any tequila here. So Fernando, would you like to come up to say a few words to kick us off?
I'll be incredibly brief because it's very difficult to sound eloquent after Duncan, right? It's a British accent. He's not really that smart, but you know, the British accent really helps.
It's the only thing I have.
And the good looks, my friend. But you know that. No, I just want to express my gratitude. My gratitude to the friendship of our institutions, right? AEM also has a North American claim. Actually, AEM was born 30 years ago after NAFTA was signed. And it was the first time that Mexican business people came to the United States, not to export goods, but actually to compete directly in the United States. And when the first business people moved, actually in Texas, San Antonio, that's where our organization is based, we didn't fit much in the chambers of commerce that were already established there. So it was actually at the consulate under Carlos Sada's leadership that it was suggested that a new organization needed to be born, right? Because the nature of the work that we were doing, the nature of the business that we were doing was something that hadn't happened before. And at that point, AEM made a big gift to the city of San Antonio. And if you go to the city of San Antonio, you'll see a sculpture, La Antorcha de la Amistad, which was a gift by AEM to the city of Los Angeles. This is the sculptor Sebastian, beautiful, beautiful torch of friendship that is now the symbol of the city of San Antonio where NAFTA was signed. And it was a statement by AEM saying, we are here and we want to be part of this community. So ever since we've tried to be leaders in the communities we're based. AEM has 16 chapters across the U.S. The Mexican business community in the U.S. is very strong and growing, very tightly knit. And we've been very, very active we were very active in the renegotiations of NAFTA last time, what became USMCA. And now we're very, very active in making sure that the North American project not only survives, but actually evolves and thrives into something that creates opportunity, shared prosperity in North America. So that's the topic of our discussion. And thank you so much to the consulates, and thanks so much for UCLA, Julio. We really congratulate you on your leadership. You're the pride of Mexico, as you know. We're very proud of you, and you've always been a role model. So we're very proud, and we wish you a lot of success. We're very sure that you're going to be very, very successful as Chancellor of UCLA, and you're going to help also through your leadership bring the name of Mexico very high. And thank you, Duncan. It's a pleasure. We've been partners in crime for many years, right? And it's a pleasure now to be partnering here in LA. Thanks so much.
Good to be organized crime.
Organized crime, yeah, that's more profitable, but...
But we were well organized today.
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone organizing the event, Juan Carlos, all the team of AEM, Alex, the people that travel very far to be here with us. Thank you all.
Well, you've had your hors d'oeuvres, and now we're going to move on to the entrees. We're going to begin north of the border, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to you tonight, Consul General Zaib Shaikh. Zaib has been serving as the Consul General of Canada in Los Angeles since December of 2018, representing Canadian interests across Southern California, Arizona, and Nevada. Before his diplomatic appointment, he had a distinguished career in the media and entertainment industries. He is best known for his role as Amar Rashid in the CBC comedy series Little Mosque on the Prairie, which, if you haven't ever seen it, is just an amazing, amazing show. It's been broadcast in over 80 countries. His acting portfolio also includes a role in Deepa Mehta's film Midnight's Children, a book which I've read and is just an extraordinary work of art. From 2014 to 2018, he served as the Film Commissioner and Director of Entertainment Industries for the City of Toronto. As many of you may know, Toronto is one of those great movie cities, filmmaking cities in North America. In this capacity, he oversaw the city's screen, music, live festival, sporting event, and tourism sectors, contributing to a significant increase in film production value, which surpassed $2 billion in 2016. His academic background includes studies in theatre at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and Sheridan College, as well as a Master of Fine Arts degree from the University of British Columbia. Consul General Zaib, Shaikh, please come up. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Duncan, and everyone for being here. Thank you, of course, to UCLA Chancellor, our great partners, Pacific Council, AEM, and of course everyone here who's come, whether you've come representing Canada from, or whether you've come from across the border. Thanks for coming from afar, and of course there's so many Canadians here right at home in Los Angeles County, Southern California, so a great hello to everyone there. And I'm so glad, thank you, Duncan, for making the land acknowledgement for the Gabrielino Tongva people and their communities. Absolutely, that is an important part of every formal and frankly, in many cases, even informal gatherings in Canada across the country. So it's incredibly kind of you to do that here. Beating us to the punch, as it were. Talking about punches tonight, I think we're going to be talking about the heavy hitting that our collective share of prosperity, ingenuity, camaraderie, partnership has achieved. But we're also going to talk a little bit about the hits that seem to keep on coming in terms of rhetoric, in terms of gamesmanship, perhaps, and definitely in terms of the art of the deal and negotiations. But let's take it back a little bit. We've heard from so many great people here already about what set us up for success, but bearing the fact that I am representing north of the border, I want to sort of lens a little bit closer on Canada's connectivity and Canada's partnership here in the U.S., and then I know my great friend and colleague Carlos, the Consul General Gutiérrez from González Gutiérrez from Mexico, will be speaking to really illuminate what has been happening on Mexico's side. It's an esteemed group, an esteemed set of introductions. So I'll keep, I won't be as esteemed in my language, perhaps. I'm not as flourished, but I'm pretty good with a script, if you know what I mean. So let's begin. Look, in the aftermath of the US election, not just here, but definitely around the world, and we'll speak about that too, I'm sure the panelists will discuss that. There have been many recent questions, commentaries, and even perhaps some criticisms, let's be honest, about globalization and whether there are any benefits to cross-border links. Our great introductions and those who introduced us, I think already showcased the possibility, the probability, and the reality of that. But it clearly, this moment in time gives us cause to remind ourselves, remind each other, and perhaps make a few more commitments. Let me be clear with my response to those questions, commentary, and perhaps those criticisms. Together, Canada, the United States, and of course Mexico have created the wealthiest, most competitive trade bloc in the history of the world. At over $31 trillion, our three nations together account for about 30% of the global economy. To put that into perspective, for those who might still be saying, well, what does 30% really mean? The European Union's combined GDP is about $20 billion. And China's is 17 billion. And I just quoted you $31 trillion for 3 countries on this side of the world that happen to intersect beautifully here in LA and LA County. Since its entry into force, 1994, or it was enforced, I shouldn't say it was forced, it was enforced in 1994, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, of course, between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, has helped generate economic growth and raise the standard of living, which is key and essential to what we're talking about, for all inhabitants of those 3 countries since its inception. From a trilateral perspective, NAFTA 1.0, we're speaking about Trump 2.0, but it's important to remind us how we got here. NAFTA 1.0 supported the development of an integrated and competitive North American market and supply chain, as Duncan mentioned, as the Chancellor mentioned. It provided manufacturers, producers, investors, consumers with a predictable and secure commercial environment. It made Canada, the US, and Mexico, as a collective, the most competitive region in the world by giving business the ability to leverage a whole lot. Natural resources, manufacturing capability, intellectual property, human capital, and investment from across the continent in a super integrated supply chain manner. And we're not just talking about the supply chain of goods or products. We're talking about the supply chain of mindset and services. During the first Trump administration, of course, not so long ago, I was here, I had just started in 2018. Threats happened about that agreement, but of course, we all came together. The 3 countries enforced, shared an agreement that they then called USMCA. Let's just call it USMCA for now because we're in the United States, which in fact has improved upon the first deal. In fact, the White House at that time, President Trump 1.0, called it the best deal he'd ever made and ever signed. So it's important to remember that for a person who talks about the art of the deal, who maintains that negotiating prowess and talks about always wanting a great deal by the end of it, that deal that currently is at risk and is under threat was the best deal that he had ever made, according to him, at that time. And that was true. He wasn't just talking or saying something out loud. He actually was right. And there was a lot of facts to back it up. Citizens, communities, and businesses in all 3 countries have all benefited because that agreement has seen greater yields for that goods, services, product, intellectual capacity, and intellectual property going across those 3 borders. We've seen greater yields, record successes coming because of that agreement, notwithstanding that perhaps it isn't the most perfect agreement, but it's a great deal, and that's important. So now we talk about Trump 2.0, we talk about what's happening now, and we talk about, as the time ticks, in about a couple of weeks, where those deadlines about tariffs are definitely on the table from all sides at this point, and that's going to be clear as well. That it's really now risking what we have all built together for the last 30, 40 years. Wiping that out is not something any of us want to imagine, let alone take on, and even worse, live and realize as a reality of our collective lives and livelihoods. The North American Free Trade Agreement with our integrated supply chain has been critical to our shared prosperity, as I've said. Canada is California's number 2 partner. Number 2 partner globally, with over $20 billion in goods and $9.5 billion in services to Canada every year. Not the import, the export we're talking about. Now, when we think about import, California's imports from Canada are crucial to keeping the Californian economic engine not only clean and safe, but roaring. On energy alone, California imports $922 million per year in crude oil and $607 million per year in electricity. That keeps the lights going on. That keeps the underpinnings of California's economic success thriving. Just this past year, Canada was once again named as one of the Titan countries of foreign direct investment in California, as one of the top 4 sources of FDI in the state. And we all know the value of FDI. It creates jobs, it secures careers, and it propels prosperity. And if we go across the US, if we don't just look at California, Canada is once again, the stats bearing out that we're the top customer for the US in goods and service exports, with Canada buying more US goods than China, Japan, France, and the United Kingdom combined. We have 39 million people in our country. This state has 39 million people in its borders. We're one of the largest, smallest countries in the world, and we're helping the US more than China, Japan, France, and the UK combined. Countries that I'm pretty sure are box office countries when you think of some of the biggest names in the world right now, moving, shaking, and making and breaking things as they go along. So that's something from Canada's point of view to celebrate and to actually take 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps further. And beyond trade alone, I have to be honest, I can't underscore enough how Canada and the United States are close allies, partners, and friends. As President John F. Kennedy said, perhaps you've all heard this before, trust me, every Canadian remembers this: geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. He said it in a way better accent than I did, but you know what I mean. We have our differences, of course. That's what makes great friends great. Not just how they're same, but how they're different and how they use those differences to complement each other. And how they use those differences to support each other, because Canada has been there at some of the darkest times in America's history. We stood alongside in World War II, side by side. In the name of democracy and peace, we joined in the Korean Peninsula and the Gulf. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, in the midst of the terrible tragedy and crises all around, passenger planes headed from the US and they were rerouted for Canada. We were proud to take in almost 45,000 diverted passengers and planes, and we stood with America, not just in solidarity, but in grief and sorrow as well. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Canada was there to help New Orleans rebuild. And during the Iranian hostage crisis, Canadian diplomats risked it all to free our American friends, and Ben Affleck even got an Oscar, I think, for it. So, let's get closer to the calendar. The Chancellor talked about his second day, real day on the job. Well, when those wildfires started raging last month, because it's already last month, and it seems just like a minute ago, Canada and Mexico were there. Myself and our consulate team were on the phone and on emails, around the clock, it seemed, frankly, to facilitate assistance from across Canada, from our ministers, from our Prime Minister, talking to the Governor, from our Health Minister, from our Public Safety Minister, and I can tell you that in Canada, the reaction, seeing those images on the news, wasn't just, oh my God, how horrible. It was, what can we do? Where do we send it? What do they need? How fast? Here's what it is. It was almost overwhelming for our team to get those offers of support. And we know that our partners understood this because the phone calls and the emails and the official letters from the governor's office, from State Department officials, from firefighting crews and first responders to those Canadian and Mexican firefighting responders right there on the ground and in the air, they came in droves, and they all came with thank you. You are our best friends. We know we couldn't do this without you. And thanks so much for still being here, because guess what? They understood the conversations that were happening in Washington, D.C. at that time. And in spite of those conversations, they knew what the reality was, and therefore they responded to the reality, not the commentary. So, next week I'm going to be in Washington, actually. I was telling the Chancellor and my dear friend Carlos here, and we're going to be speaking, of course, with our ambassador, but we're also going to be on the Hill, as they say, really looking to remind our members in Senate and in Congress from Southern California of that friendship, that partnership, that allyship that has been here through and through, day in, day out, and recently was shown minute by minute, hour by hour. I know they know that, but it's going to need to be reiterated in the halls in DC, and hopefully loud enough so that others can hear, because I'm sure that it's not our Southern California members, for the most part, that need that reminder. And it's not even you fine folks here in this room. But it does take these gatherings, it does take these rooms, even when people know exactly what the answer is, to remind each other that we're here for a purpose, we're here for a reason, and we're here to make good and do good on our commitments. With that, I want to thank you. I just want to remind us that not only are we your biggest customer, the U.S. is stronger and more competitive globally because of this economic partnership. And if the U.S., as the President says, is really looking to usher in a new golden age, well then Canada and Mexico are front and center of that reality. Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Consul General. It's now a great pleasure for me to introduce the Consul General of Mexico, Carlos González Gutiérrez. Ambassador Carlos González Gutiérrez has been serving as Consul General of Mexico in Los Angeles since February of last year, following his unanimous ratification by the Mexican Senate in December of 2023. A career diplomat since 1987, Ambassador González Gutiérrez has dedicated his service to strengthening ties between Mexico and its diaspora in the United States. His experience in this field is vast. He has worked across this country in multiple key positions, and he has become one of the most important leaders of the Mexican community abroad here in the United States. In the late 1990s, he contributed to the program for Mexican communities abroad within Mexico's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From 2003 to 2009, he served as the inaugural executive director of the IME, the Institute of Mexicans Abroad, an agency focused on fostering collaboration between Mexico and its citizens residing overseas. His diplomatic assignments in the United States are noteworthy. Early in his career, he was here in Los Angeles as the Consul for Community Affairs. Subsequently, from 1999 to 2003, he served as the Counselor for Latino Affairs at the Mexican Embassy in Washington, D.C. He has served also in Sacramento, in Austin, and in San Diego. In September of 2011, in recognition of his exemplary service, he was promoted to the rank of ambassador. Academically, he holds a bachelor's degree in international relations from the Colegio de Mexico and a master's degree in international relations from the University of Southern California. He has been published widely, focusing on the Mexican population here in the United States. On a personal note, let me just say, Carlos, it's just always an enormous pleasure to be with you in a room, to hear you speak, and to interact with you, because I always learn something. And so please come up and share your thoughts with us tonight.
Muchísimas gracias, Duncan. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I want to, first of all, echo what Fernando Sepúlveda said. Julio Frank is the pride of Mexico, and we are so proud that in this city, the chancellor of UCLA is a Mexican national. Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, Fernando Sepúlveda, and my friend from the AEM. I enjoyed always being convened by you to talk about issues of mutual interest. I see many friends. I want to thank the people who made this possible at IAM, like Juan Carlos, Javier, Fernando. But in particular, I want to For those of you who don't know, and I hope he forgives me, I want to signal the presence of a very brilliant Mexican businessman who's an immigrant and who's the founder of the North Gate supermarkets chain here in Southern California. Don Miguel González, me siento muy orgulloso de que usted esté aquí. Muchas gracias. If you need to talk with someone who's the embodiment of the benefits of integration between our economies, Don Miguel, estoy seguro, is the best person to talk during the tequila time. I'm just going to make 5 points. I'm very honored to follow my dean at the Consular Corps and my dear friend, the Consul General of Canada in LA. I just want to complement what he said, but because in the end, our perspectives are not that different. And following him, following my dean, following my dear friend Zaib, I want to mention only 5 points. And I'll try to be as brief as possible because we all want to hear the panel. My first point is kind invitation to you all to put yourselves in the shoes of Mexico. Or Canada for that purpose. To imagine the negotiators who 30 plus years ago negotiated NAFTA. Imagine them negotiating with their counterparts who back then came from a government, a Republican government, that believed deeply in 2 principles. Free trade is good, the tide raises all boats, and immigration in the long term is good for the host society. Those 2 very basic principles, the ones in which I was educated, in which many of us were educated, those are the ones who Republicans today, and unfortunately many Democrats, put into doubt. No? They questioned the validity of both points. And currently, we have a government in the United States that see every trade negotiation as a zero-sum game in which there will be winners and losers. You are a sucker if you have a deficit. You are a winner if you have a superávit. Very mercantilistic point of view. Now, furthermore, everything is linked together. You cannot negotiate on one track immigration, another track drug trafficking collaboration, and another track trade. Everything is linked. And the access to this market is for this government a valid tool for leverage with both rivals and friends. From the perspective of the Mexican government, if we are all able to put ourselves in the shoes of Mexico, I think that it is clear that things have changed, that the paradigm is collapsing, and that it is what it is. We need to learn how to deal with a government that truly believes that free trade is a zero-sum game and that immigration in the long term is bad for the United States. But we should never forget that it has actually been very good. As Zaib was saying, it's been great for the 3 countries. And from our perspective, imagine where were we at 30 years ago. Today, we are the top trading partner of the United States. Mexican exports have multiplied by 10 under NAFTA, and the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship has reached $800 billion per year. Naturally, we are the #1 trading partner of the U.S. My second issue, my second point. if we need to face reality, if we need to recognize that it is what it is, I think that it is one thing to recognize that decision makers today think in a different paradigm. At the same time, we should be able to not allow this new paradigm to impede us, to obstruct us, the ability to distinguish myth from facts, and don't live in a circle of disinformation. As I was listening to news this afternoon. What do I mean by distinguishing myths from facts? Those who advocate in favor of tariffs, they make two main arguments that are completely absurd, and I'm sure that the panel will address this. Argument number one, tariffs do not create inflation. That is false. We export to this region approximately half of all vegetables and fruit that California imports. Imagine that you were imposed not a 25% tariff, a 3% tariff on all those products. What would that create if not inflation? That is a fact. The other very important point that helps us distinguish fact from myth is the second argument that they make. They say, if you want to avoid tariffs, easy. Just bring your products to the United States, simply move everything to America, and you will avoid tariffs. It's a very simplistic import substitution model that has never worked anywhere, let alone in Mexico when we tried it during the 70s and the 60s and 70s. We eventually had to move into free trade. And the best way I have found, or one of the best ways I have found, that the best explanation of why this is such a big myth is a column that I strongly suggest you to read by Tom Friedman, the last column he wrote for the New York Times, in which he says, nowadays, no country in the world alone can make an iPhone. There is no country that can make by itself an iPhone. There's no country that by itself can make a Ford Mustang or a Silverado pickup. All those very sophisticated products that enrich our lives, they have behind massive networks of manufacturing, trading, and services ecosystems in which people, parts, and knowledge all move back and forth across borders. And I think that what NAFTA and the USMCA built, a shared production platform with integrated production chains between the three countries, is the best possible example of not one or two, but multiple ecosystems that could not survive in a single country, not even the most powerful one, as is the United States. Point number three, it is very difficult to negotiate with anybody who's always moving the post, que siempre está moviendo la portería, that is always a moving target. For us, for Canada, for Mexico, some days tariffs are explained as a way to raise revenue. And the next day, they are framed as an issue of reciprocity. And the next day, they are framed as an issue of justice, social justice. And then the next day, they are presented as a strategy to curb fentanyl or to curb undocumented flows of migration. It is extremely difficult to negotiate in these circumstances. And in this context is where President Claudia Sheinbaum faced as Prime Minister Trudeau a very difficult challenge during the first weeks of Trump administration. She was constrained in terms of pre-inauguration dialogue. In other words, President Trump did not allow for a delegation from Mexico to come before inauguration in order to talk about certain basic terms. Unlike what happened during Trump 1.0, there was no contact ahead of time. Once he assumed power, the president of Mexico did not send anybody to Washington to start negotiations, not even the ambassador. She tried to keep a cool-headed approach. On Thursday before February 4th, the day when tariffs were gonna enter into force, she announced that she believed that tariffs would never enter into force. And on February 3rd, as we all know, she talked directly with President Trump, and those tariffs were suspended for 30 years. 30, I hope 30 years, for 30 days, for 30 days. When the target is always moving, it's very difficult to achieve success. And we shall not mislead ourselves. There is a cost around this uncertainty, and we are all paying for that cost, not only Mexico, not only Canada, but also the United States. I finish with my point number 4 and number 5 very quickly. Point number 4, we are doing our share. We are doing our share, we are doing our part, because we want to collaborate with the US. We need to collaborate with the US, particularly in the fight against drug trafficking, because it's a regional problem. And we do it also because it is in our interest. Perhaps we have failed miserably as a government to sell this as a strategy that benefits Mexico. We do it because it's in our interest, not necessarily because the US asked us to do it. But let me give you some numbers that, to me, in my opinion, are impressive. Number of people detained because of their ties to organized crime during the first 100 days of President López Obrador, 31. Number of people detained because of their ties to organized crime during the first 100 days of President Sheinbaum, 7,720. 31 during López Obrador administration, 7,720 during this administration. Number of confiscated firearms during first 100 days, López Obrador 26, President Sheinbaum 3,000 plus. I can give you numbers and numbers and numbers about the seriousness that this government is taking the fentanyl problem and the fight against organized crime. In terms of migration, illegal crossings have come down 78%, even before President Trump took office. 78% illegal border crossings through the northern border had already fallen down as a result of Mexico addressing the issue in collaboration with the administration of President Biden. We are trying to do our share. My final point. China sells everything to the world, and they tend to buy very little. That's a problem for Mexico, that's a problem for countries all over the world. But because of the size of that market, it would be dumb for Mexico to renounce to the opportunity of eventually arriving to that market. But we don't fool ourselves. We know that our future is in the integration with the United States and Canada, and we are acting accordingly. Unfortunately, we need also to debunk another myth, and that has to do with China. There was only one Chinese brand that produced light vehicles in Mexico. It produced 22,500 units. That's 0.6% of the total production in Mexico. Of the 3.3 million light vehicles that we exported to the US, none were from Chinese brands. The foreign investment that China has in Mexico is very small compared to the US. The US foreign investment is 142 times the investment that China has in Mexico, and Canada's foreign direct investment is 25 times larger. 96% of China's stock in terms of foreign investment in North America is concentrated in the United States and Canada, only 4% in Mexico. We know that in the next few years we will be talking about traceability. I don't know if you say that in English, trazabilidad. We will all be talking about rules of origin. Let's make sure that no matter how much these paradigms change, we never get confused about distinguishing myth from reality. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you again, Zaib, for your comments. I'd like now to call to the stage our panelists, beginning first of all with Alejandra Palacios, Pacific Council Board Director and External Advisor of Cuatro Casas. Secondly, Fernando Sepúlveda, who is the Chairman of US-Mexico Business Association, the AEM, and the founder and CEO of EMTECH, Emerging Technologies Institute, and Alejandro Delgado, the VP of Binational Affairs at the AEM and Managing Partner at GCR Consul. Please come to the stage. While you get comfortable, we just remind everybody of where we are right now. If you haven't listened to the daily podcast episode of a couple of days ago, which is an interview with Peter Navarro, I recommend strongly that you listen to it. It gives you a very good insight into why President Trump's leading trade and tariff advisor believes the things that he does. And it gives you insight into his own psychology, his background. It also gives you an insight into his worldview today. And I think that it's important to recognize that, because the arguments being made for tariffs in America today are that tariffs will produce jobs, tariffs will defend the working class, tariffs will make America great again, tariffs will not result in inflation, tariffs are the right thing to do because other countries have been ripping off the United States for so long. It's very, very important to understand those arguments in order to actually engage in the conversation. But this is actually not a new conversation. For those of you who are students of international economics, of course, these are conversations that we've had almost 100 years ago, during the 1930s. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1934, of course, 1930, actually imposed the most punitive tariffs on imports into the United States in history, exacerbating rather, the already terrible situation of the Great Depression. We've had periodic flirtations with tariffs as well over the years, particularly in the 1970s, during the recessions of that decade. Again, in the 1980s, when fears of Japanese economic dominance took over again. There was this idea that we would move from a century of Pax Americana to Pax Nipponica, and we all know what happened to that. Today's arguments are that the United States can no longer lead by accepting free trade, by accepting unfair trade with other countries. What I'd like to do right now is I'd like to call on Fernando to begin our conversation by giving us an overview of what has happened thus far under Trump 2.0 with regards to North American trade and tariffs, and the reaction from the Mexican and Canadian governments as well as their business communities. We've heard from the Consul General about the official reactions and where we are today in relations, but I wonder if you could give us that perspective from the business community.
Thank you, Duncan. And So I will reiterate the facts that are well known by everybody, right? Trump announced 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, 10% additional tariffs on China, on top of the tariffs that are already in place, and obviously with all the tariffs on steel and aluminum, right? And he has also announced tariffs on other partner countries. So I think that's the situation, right? I think what we need to ask ourselves is how much of that is trade policy and how much that is a negotiation tool. Okay? And at times it's hard to distinguish, but I think it's important for us to distinguish what is legitimate trade policy, because I think we cannot demonize tariffs as an illegitimate policy instrument, right? It's like taxation, right? It creates, or incentives, right? It creates market distortions. We know it as economists, right? But there are times that you need to use those instruments, and those are legitimate instruments, right? So I think first we don't need to be dogmatic about tariffs are always bad or free trade is always good, right? I think we need to kind of look at it from a case by case perspective. But I think what's happening, and that's my interpretation, right? I mean, nobody knows really what's happening, right? So this is just my, I hope, informed opinion. But I think what's happening is that in the case of Canada and Mexico, it's not really part of the trade policy. It's really part of a negotiation, right? And I would submit that the objective is to fast forward the negotiation of the USMCA. Because the legal terms of the negotiation of the USMCA push things all the way to the end of 2026. By that time, you're in the middle of the Trump presidency. And that's too late. So I would submit to you that the threat of tariffs to Canada and Mexico is a forcing device to get us into the negotiation table ahead of time and to try to reach a North American agreement in preparation for the real fight, which is against China. Right? Obviously, I don't know about that for a fact, right? But I would submit that that's the underlying strategy. Now, what's going to happen in a couple of weeks? I think we're going to get another extension, and another extension, and another extension, right? I don't think those threats are going to go away until the Trump administration gets what the Trump administration is looking for in terms of that negotiating purpose. But I think we need to distinguish that from the other tariffs that he has announced, which is the reciprocal tariffs. And I think that framework actually is the real part of his trade strategy, right? That is part of the philosophy of Leitzinger and his Peter Lovato and his advisors, right? I think they truly believe that trade should be fair and tariffs should be reciprocal, right? And I think that is the part where I don't think it's a negotiating instrument. I think that's really their policy thinking. And I think in that respect, both Mexico and the US, we don't really impose that many tariffs to the United States, right? I think India should be feeling very, very threatened. China obviously should feel very, very threatened, because if you apply that reciprocal tariff logic, right, then it becomes very, very punishing in terms of agreement. So I'll just stop there, right, because I think we need to distinguish negotiation instrument versus the real trade policy. And I also think that there are some legitimate claims on the Trump administration side on the use of tariffs and using tariff correction to modify terms of trade.
Thank you, Fernando. I recall very clearly a conversation that I had with Wilbur Ross when he was Commerce Secretary about the issue of reciprocal tariffs. It was something they wanted to do in the first administration, and in some ways it makes a lot of sense. It is what the post-Second World War economic order was built on, was that the United States would accept that other countries would have higher tariffs on US goods, whilst the United States lowered its own tariffs. But those days are long gone. And so I think there is generally a consensus that that makes sense at this point in time, and even the Europeans have explicitly accepted that concept when it comes to autos. But there is, of course, that other element there, which is that the Trump administration, or Trump himself, has said that it's not just tariffs, it's restrictive business practices as well that will come into play, leaving open to interpretation a huge area of economic policy, including, of course, regulation. And that brings me to Hannah, as somebody who has, spent a lot of time thinking about regulation, competition policy, etc. I want to ask you, what's at stake here in North America? When you come outside of policy circles, most people really either don't care about North American economic integration, or they have a negative view of it. And that's one of the great failures, I would say, of our public relations strategy of the past 35 years. And they reject economic integration in North America because they've heard the stories, or they know somebody. They know that jobs have been lost here in the United States, and they believe that that's as a result of NAFTA and USMCA. Going back to Ross Perot's giant sucking sound, we've had this idea that jobs lose. And of course, there is the loss of jobs, but there's also the gain in jobs. I wonder, Hannah, if you could tell us about what the past 30 years of economic integration has meant to the North American economy in a balanced perspective.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know if I can have a balanced perspective on what things are happening, but what the free trade agreement has created is like this massive trade among the three countries. And both general counsels have said it already, but it's not only that we trade, it's that we build things together. And that is like a game changer in terms of trade. Because it's not only that agricultural products will be higher in the US if eventually these tariffs come about. It's that when you're building a car, many times, 10 times, 20 times, things go back and forth the border. And you cannot or should not impose tariffs every time things come and go back, because that will make it inaccessible. And it also means we have super integrated supply chains, and these won't necessarily change in the short term. So prices will go up here and there. And the thing is that in Mexico and Canada, the consequences will be bigger. Like the Mexican government always says that the Trump administration won't go forward with the prolonged 25% tariff because it will create inflation. And there's a story in the US where this happened, and then eventually they had to retire those tariffs because inflations were over the sky. The thing is that US and Mexico, their exports to, what they export is equivalent to 80% of all of their exports. So the impact is huge. So I can't talk about the US, but like in the Mexican case, Trump has talked about imposing tariffs to Mexico since the campaign. And he initially talked about 10% tariffs. And if you look at the exchange rate, the peso has depreciated in the past 2 months. And the market sort of has embedded the idea that there will be a modification, that the trade agreement, when the negotiation starts, either it be today or in a year and a half, it will be different. There might be reciprocal charges, which are not right now part of the agreement. So, the world has changed, and everybody knows that the next negotiations will be different. So the outcome will be different. And the market has sort of, between these reciprocal things and what Trump said in the campaign, has sort of embedded that a 10% tariff, one way or the other, will be part of it. And in that case, what those who analyze markets say is that it won't impact that much in Mexico GDP because, as I said, the Mexico peso will depreciate, and so then it will be cheaper for the US to buy Mexican things, and so you put tariffs, but then it's cheaper to buy, so then at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game. And so that would be the scenario. Mexico today, the equivalent to the Federal Reserve in the US, which is the Banco de Mexico, downgraded Mexico's expectancy of growth rate. It was 1% and now it's 0.6 because of all this that is happening. But if tariffs go into the 25%, then Mexico will go into a recession, at least a 1.5 decrease. I don't know the numbers for Canada, but something like that could happen. And so, will the integration be maintained over time? For certain supply chains, I guess it will. I mean, you can't in the short run, I mean, in the next 5, 6, 10 years, modify your supply chains completely. So, will integration keep growing? Maybe not. Who will benefit from all this? The three countries have benefited. In the US perspective, Mexico and Canada have benefited more, especially Mexico. And so like the idea is that going forward, the US also benefits from it. Can this integration disappear? I don't think so. The integration has happened despite governments. I mean, in this past 30 years, government really didn't do anything specifically to create this integration. It was the business sector, little by little, integration was created. The risk is that this long-run tendency can be diluted. And 3 years ago, I was worried that this tendency would be derailed because AMLO was not complying with our commitments to the USMCA. Now I'm worried that this integration or this tendency will derail because if Trump stresses Mexico and Canada too much, you can pull una liga, you can pull the rubber band so much. So those are my initial thoughts. I'm everywhere, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Hannah. I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of flexible exchange rates. It's one of the points that Rogelio Ramirez de la O, the Secretary of Hacienda in Mexico, raised in a recent call with investors. And it pointed out exactly what you said, that there has been this depreciation of the Mexican peso, almost exactly equivalent to that 10% tariff level. And of course, during times of great uncertainty, we are seeing a flight globally towards the dollar. Alejandro, you've spent years in the fields of entrepreneurship, economic development, investment, and venture capital. As you're looking at the markets today, and you're looking at the investment climate in North America, what is the impact of the current uncertainty on that climate?
Yeah, thank you, Duncan, and thank you, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Well, all these things that you said that I've been doing over the years, entrepreneurship, economic development, investment, and venture capital, have three principles. Number one, productivity. Number two, innovation. Number three, growth. I don't see how tariffs address any of these principles. I really don't. I don't see how a low-value product substitution will contribute to this in the US, not to say in Canada or Mexico. Is it really possible, as Hannah just said? Is it really possible? I mean, 35% of the value of all cars, automobiles, and trucks brought from Mexico to the US have US value. US content. 40% of all auto parts in the US come from Mexico. Others from Canada, I'm sure. Is it really possible to get rid of that? Is like a life without Mexicans? Is it really possible? So I think that even Fernando put it on the table, that we're seeing negotiating strategies, which can be rough. I mean, that Saturday was a terrible day for many of us. Instead of skiing the slopes of Colorado, I was making calls and receiving calls all day. So that's just crazy. Just keep in mind that 45 cents per every dollar exported from Mexico are US products, have US content. So the integration that we've had over the past 30 years, and us who negotiated the original NAFTA, that's what we bet for. From Bush, Salinas, all the way down in the ladder. And it takes me back to Bretton Woods. Why these institutions in Bretton Woods were founded. Number one, peace. And I'm really worried about that. And I think many people are. Investment into Mexico has halted. Okay, you don't see many projects, maybe some expansions, but many projects are still watching from the fence on what's going to happen. And I guess for me, the key concept is what tariffs provide a misallocation of resources. It doesn't produce anything if you pay 25%, 35%, 40%. Because all these products will not be. I mean, can really the US make widgets, bulbs, harnesses, wires? I don't see that happening. So anyway, so we're facing it. We're grinding. We have meetings. I have meetings all over the next 5 days in the Ministry of Economy in Mexico. I'm part of the private sector staff accompanying the Mexican government, and I mean, we're making strategy and so forth. But what I foresee, along the lines of what Hannah just said, is inflation, the stockouts. Just keep in mind that in the time of the COVID, you guys had a 50% stockout in things like food and beverages. Mexico came along and solved part of that crisis. So I don't know. I think really, they really need to think about it and see what's going to happen. Dollar appreciation, as you said, I see that happening. Reduction of growth, both in the U.S., Mexico, and maybe Canada, I'm sure. So that's what is in our minds right now. Duncan.
Thank you, Alejandro. And just your point about the widget. You know, if we don't buy a widget from Mexico, there are many other places where you can buy that widget, but they're not going to be made in the United States. And, you know, there's a commonly, circulated meme going around, which is that, you know, Americans actually don't want to have the jobs that produce those widgets. But the truth is that companies who are looking for those suppliers here in the United States find that they just simply don't exist. And that's true not just for Canadian and Mexican inputs into the industrial process. It's true for those inputs coming around the world. Semiconductors being a prime example of that. Fernando, you gave us an idea of what you think is going to happen next, what Trump's strategy is. The man is tremendous at putting issues on the table and getting people to focus. He focuses minds. What do you believe the end game is then for the administration in North America? How do you feel that the issue of across-the-board tariffs fit in with the steel and aluminum tariffs that have already been announced? And more importantly, how does North America as an economic unit allow the United States to engage more competitively with China and with other economic competitors? And perhaps how many billions of dollars are we talking about now in North American trade? Hundreds of billions of dollars question. What do you think will happen now with the USMCA review process?
Let me reframe the question. Sorry.
That's a good trick to reframe the question. When journalists interview you, right, you never answer what they ask you. You answer what you want to talk about. Right? So I'm using that trick now. No,
that's what I do when I come home late from the bar as well.
No, I think, let me answer from this perspective. Let me tell you what I think the end game should be. I don't know what it is, right? But I can offer what I think it should be, because then I think we can craft a strategy to help us get into that end game, right? And I would submit that kind of a key principle of any negotiation is that you need to focus on expanding the pie before focusing on dividing the pie, right? That's one of the most kind of basic principles of negotiations. You need to expand the pie. And that's exactly what we did last time, right? You remember that the key difference between NAFTA and the USMCA was two new chapters, the energy chapter and the electronic digital commerce chapter. And that was really what got us through the line, right? It was really thinking about the opportunity of what else could we do together rather than just, right, pulling the blanket from one side to the other. So if you think from a geopolitical perspective, I think there are basically three things that are crucial, and those are, I think, the real battles that are happening from a geopolitical perspective. One is semiconductors and the implication of semiconductors to artificial intelligence, right? That is probably the most disruptive force in the economy worldwide. I think it's widely recognized. You saw that at the conference in Paris. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to J.D. Vance's speech, which was, I think, pretty good, by the way, in Paris. And he was laying out a vision of why having control of the full technology stack on artificial intelligence, starting from chips, going into models, and into processing artificial intelligence, was of the most strategic importance to the US. So I think Mexico and Canada should focus on working with the Trump administration and ensuring that we create a semiconductors AI chapter into whatever negotiation is on the table. Because that's really expanding the pie, right? Those are the real areas where they're interested in terms of geopolitical dominance vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis other regions. So I think that's one of the areas where we need to focus on expanding the pie. And I think if we can shape the game and we can shape the conversation for that to be the end game, I think we will all come as winners. The second one is electromobility. If you look at North American trade, in reality, kind of the big success story of North American integration is a big success story of the automotive industry integration, right? If you look at the real trade that's happening between Canada, the US, and Mexico, a huge portion of that is the automotive sector. Now, the automotive sector is in the midst of a huge technological transformation, right? And China is winning that game. BYD is winning the game, right? The European firms are winning the game. So I think it's also of strategic importance to the US to focus on that technological transition. And again, it's one of the strengths of North America, and I think we need to, again, expand the pie and focus on how we can make that happen, right? Many of the tariffs, even at the Biden administration, were focused on electric vehicles. The US is scared to death of competition from China in terms of electric vehicles. So I think that is the other area that we need to absolutely focus. And in the end, I think what ties these two things together is energy.
the consumption of energy from AI data centers is just off the roof, right? So energy security in North America, I think, is a third great factor that we need to focus on. And we already have a chapter of that, but we need to make that work, because we signed and we never did much, right? So I think reviving the energy chapter, right? Because electromobility is powered by electricity, and AI data centers are powered by electricity. So I think that's a trifecta, right? I think we need to focus on making sure that we expand the pie, focusing on those three key areas. And I think that's what's going to make the Trump administration and all of the U.S. and the Mexican and the Canadian governments really be able to have enough value to share to reach an agreement. The other thing that I would say, in terms of how do you get to that end game, I think we need to focus on Texas. And let me say why. Texas represents 60% of the trade with Mexico. The big loser of this whole thing unwinding is Texas. The other two states are California and Michigan, but California and Michigan are Democrats, right? So they have no influence on the White House. So I think we need to convince Texas that Mexico and Canada are their greatest allies for prosperity for their state. And we need to have Texas be the advocate for the North American trade. We did a little bit of that in the previous negotiation. We had a strategy called Boots on the Ground, and we focused all our efforts on Texas. I think now Canada and Mexico needs to really focus on Texas and make the Texans make the case for that North American vision. Because obviously the Trump administration is not going to listen to us. We're not going to listen to the Canadians, right? But they will listen to Texas. So I think we need to focus on Texas and sell that vision to Texas.
Thank you, Fernando. It's a compelling idea because the folks in Texas will be a very receptive audience. They get it. They get North America. Hannah, thinking again about the impact of the uncertainty on North America. You have worked on questions of competition policy. One of the things that we've seen as a process, as a result of North American integration, has been the progressive harmonization of regulations, the increasing economies of scale within the region. What happens now to that approach in the macro and micro economies? Are you fearful of the outlook for the smaller companies in particular? Is it going to be the big boys who dominate now even more than ever?
If they put tariffs, yes. Let me just, before answering your question, I want to touch upon something that Fernando said that I think it's really interesting. So, the biggest hit of the USMCA or the NAFTA was the manufacturing integration. But one important spillover is regulatory convergence. So Mexico's antitrust law, first Mexican antitrust law, was implemented in Mexico as a commitment of the Mexican government when the first NAFTA was signed in 1994. Because if U.S. companies wanted to come to Mexico, they needed to know that they would have a level playing field. So Mexico committed on writing an antitrust law and implementing an antitrust agency. And then in time, as Fernando says, in the USMCA, we have the energy chapter, and then we also have the trade chapter. And the trade chapter is very important because it has commitments from the Mexican government and the Canadian government in terms of cybersecurity issues. And if you stretch it a little bit, also on how to regulate artificial intelligence. And then if we keep on working together, something that's going to be new for Mexico, Canada has it already. And it has it because it wants to be a good partner with the US, is Mexico strengthening its foreign direct investment regime. Because now the regime foreign direct investment regime in Mexico, which would be the equivalent to Zaib here in the US, is very, very lax. If you don't invest in transportation, telecommunications, and airlines, basically any company from anywhere can invest in Mexico. And I mean, if we keep on working together, Mexico will need to heighten that regulation. And so it's good for Mexico. This, I believe, this regulatory convergence is good for Mexico because we bring best practices, and that makes our economy more prosperous. So I look forward for these new negotiations, and I do believe, I mean, as they've said here, the North American platform is the most competitive in the world. 17% of what's trading around the world comes from the integration of US, Canada, and Mexico. So almost 20% of what's being commerced around the world comes from this platform. So that's really important. And going back to crises and tariffs, normally those when there's a crisis and when there's tariffs and also in industrial policy, big companies with big pockets who have a lot of money in the bank and they can sit down and ride the waves while there's an economic crisis, survive. So when there's a crisis, what happens is that small and medium companies lose market, and markets do get more concentrated in time, and so that's the risk for Mexico, the US, and Canada going forward.
Thank you, Hannah. One of the outcomes that I expect to result from the negotiations that take place will be pressure on Mexico to have its own version of CFIUS, a Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. Canada has its own version, and I suspect that's going to be one of the issues that we see come up. Alejandra, our last question before we open up to the audience. If you were advising President Trump and Peter Navarro on trading relations with Canada and Mexico, what is the argument?
They will fire you immediately.
What is the argument that you would make for deeper integration rather than steeper tariffs? And you can make an economic argument if you want, but there has to be a political argument in there as well. And Fernando and Hannah, you may be smiling, but I'll turn the question to you afterwards, okay, as well. Alejandro.
Thank you. Okay, so I guess the first item that I would bring to the table would be somewhere along the lines of what Carlos and our General Counsel from Canada were talking about, this success story of integration. 30 years of success, yes, with challenges, yes, with major spaces for improvement and so forth, but we have created wealth. We have growth, and we have made the productive system better, the three countries together. And that story, I think, has many aspects that could make them think that not only NAFTA, but then the USMCA were great instruments for making the three countries better. Making Mexico more prosperous is in the interest of the United States for its security, for its immigration, and so forth. So it only makes sense. Number two, I would talk about efficiency. And then again, the more efficient you make a market, the fairer it is. The more efficient it is, the easier it is for small, medium companies to access the market. The easier it is for consumers to buy, and so on. So when we talk about efficiency, yes, we talk a free market. We talk about the movement. I wish it would be of people, but at least for capital and for goods. And it only allows of the right allocation of resources, so that the US keeps building high value items and keeps bringing to life companies like, I don't know, ChatGPT and other companies that have used those resources instead of doing other less valuable things. And I think that Mexico and Canada, but in our case, Mexico, it's a key player for the US's competitiveness and productivity. Of course, again, fair trade. And when I talk about fair trade, I talk about the famous China backdoor, okay? So I really think that we need to get together and think how we can tackle the China challenge together. From the technical standpoint, us, because I mean, we're not politicians in the sense of dealing with Chinese and in that sense. But yeah, we can get to see the substitution elasticity of, I don't know, maybe 3,000 products. Because if you see some of the reports in the automotive industry brought by the White House to the Congress, you see that the industry is complaining that they cannot substitute some of these components and sub-products. So I think it's something that if we work together, we may come to Donald Trump's desk and say, we're substituting 150 billion US from China together. And let's see what we do with the rest. How we invest, how we make a plan to, I don't know, make better solar cells or make cheaper chips and so forth. So I think China in and of itself will be tackled better by the three countries than only by the US in itself. For me, what may be happening, it's a self-inflicted pandemic where you may have stockouts, you may have inflation and supply chain disruption. I think that who's going to pay for that? The taxpayer, the consumer, and so forth. So I would stress the point that whomever is going to pay at the end of the day, of course, Mexico will pay, Canada will pay, but most of all, the US consumer, the small and medium companies in the US and so forth. So that I would try to make that argument. I know they have a different paradigm. I know it's difficult. As Hannah said, they will fire me right after this pitch. Maybe I'll go back to Guadalajara and be as happy as always. I might bring some tequila, yeah, of course. But that's where I would take that line. Yeah. Hannah.
Yeah. They would fire me also, because I would say that the best functioning part of Mexico is the best functioning parts of Mexico, their economy and, I mean, geographically, regionally, are those linked with this regional integration we've been talking about. So, I mean, we've had 30 years of experience seeing how certain parts of Mexico have come out of poverty because of this integration. And then I would also remind them what President Reagan said in 1979, that a key to America's own future would lie both in Mexico and Canada if they would become stronger countries.
Thank you. Per? I wouldn't make an economic argument. I would make a fully political argument. And I think we're not dealing with ideologues, right? These are not people driven by ideology, right? These are not people who have a clear vision. These are not people who are influenced by classes, right? I think we're dealing with people who are highly pragmatic, right? And I think the key question that they're going to be asking themselves on any negotiation is, what's in it for me? And I would make a purely political argument. I think in the end, they need to bring the goods to their voters and to their constituencies, right? And so I would ask myself, who are they listening to, right? And how can we make the right arguments so it makes sense to them on their terms, not on our terms? They don't care about poverty in Mexico. They don't care about
terms of trade. They care about what their core constituencies are looking after, right? So if you think of it, I mean, going back to my argument on AI, semiconductors, electromobility, and energy, well, look at who funded Trump's campaign, right? You have Elon Musk, right, fighting, right, with a bare fist fight with Sam Altman, right, on control of AI. Look at what's happening with Intel and what's going to be the end game there. Drill, baby, drill. Energy, right? So these people are funding his political ambitions, right? And he's listening to them. And we need to think what's on their agenda and what's in it for them, right? So I think we need to make those arguments. Also a political argument is the Hispanic demographic is the highest growth demographic in the United States. I don't think any political party can dominate the political scene without the Hispanic demographic. And by the way, that was proven by Univision, right? And some very shrewd Mexican business people, right, who partnered with the Trump campaign and pushed the Latino vote in his favor. So I think we need to frame it in their terms, not in our terms, right? And in making sure that their interest aligns with the things that interest to us. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to persuade the Trump administration, right? And again, I think it's not us speaking to them, but actually advocating through our allies, right, to speak on the North American project's behalf. I think that's the strategy.
Thank you all. Do we have time for one or two questions from the audience? Is anybody, Alfred, or are you anxious to get to the tequila? I'm not seeing any hands go up, so what I'm going to say is this. I will take a lesson from Canada in 2013, January 2013. Canada was lobbying hard at the beginning of the second Obama administration for the approval of the Keystone XL pipeline. And I was lucky enough to be invited to the Canadian Embassy in Washington on Inauguration Day. And they had an ice sculpture there of the Keystone XL pipeline. But they weren't putting oil through it. They were putting Canadian Crown Royal maple whiskey through it. And the line to get a loose shot of maple whiskey on that day was huge. And I have to say, there's a certain amount of marketing genius in Canada that maybe we can learn and we can use in these difficult times. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to our audience.